before he left, sir?
Well, I wish him luck. He's got a big thing. We'll find out what's going on. They're militarily defeated.
20 Iranian patrol boats were already inside the carrier's comfort zone when the ocean stopped looking wide. Off the gray flank of a U.S. supercarrier squeezing through the Strait of Hormuz, the water had turned into geometry, angles, and closing rates. Small wakes multiplied off the bow and along the beam. The lead boats were not wandering fishermen. They were pacing, probing, sliding across the formation just close enough to force every American watchstander to ask the same question: was this another tense escort or the first move in a swarm attack? 9 minutes after the warning chain lit up, the answer would not come from diplomacy. It would arrive low, ugly, and armed with a gun built to end arguments. The carrier was transiting the worst place to gamble with distance. The Strait of Hormuz narrows shipping, compresses maneuver, and puts warships under a microscope. A vessel the size of an aircraft carrier cannot jink like a patrol craft. It does not sidestep trouble. It carries on, deliberate, trusting its escorts, its sensors, and the discipline of the people staring through glass and optics at a horizon full of bad possibilities. On that morning, the strike group moved in a standard protective posture, destroyer ahead, cruiser astern, helicopters ready, combat systems awake. To the north lay the Iranian coast and islands that gave fast boats short legs and everyone else short reaction time. At first, the contacts looked familiar: small hulls, fast, tight spacing. Then the count kept climbing. 5 became 9, 9 became 14. By the time the tactical picture stabilized, nearly 20 Iranian patrol boats and fast inshore attack craft had formed a loose crescent around the American formation. Some stayed aft off the cruiser's quarter. Others surged ahead, crossed the lane, then turned back in. One rode parallel to the carrier at a range close enough for the sailors on deck to make out men standing behind mounted weapons. On paper, they were still outside the line that justifies gunfire, but already close enough to shape the next decision. That is why this encounter matters. A carrier is not threatened by small boats because any one of them can sink it alone. It is threatened because small boats can crowd its escorts, saturate its attention, mask a mining attempt, trigger a propaganda incident, or force a split-second mistake under cameras and missile batteries. In these waters, theater, politics, and tactical pressure live in the same mile of ocean. If one boat misreads a turn, if one nervous gunner fires, if one commander thinks the other side is bluffing, the result is not a minor scuffle. Oil routes shake. Air defenses wake up across the Gulf. Every base in range starts calculating what comes next. Iran's naval doctrine understands that pressure. The Revolutionary Guard's patrol craft are built for harassment and ambiguity. They are fast, cheap, and hard to ignore. Many are speedboats turned into armed skirmishers, fitted with machine guns, rocket rails, or crews carrying shoulder-fired missiles. They are not meant to duel a destroyer broadside to broadside. They are meant to get close, stay mobile, and force a larger power to choose between restraint and overreaction. Against merchant ships, they intimidate. Against warships, they test nerves. Against a carrier, they create the worst thing in a choke point: too many moving threats and not enough water. On the American side, the problem was not firepower. It was time. Surface search radars could track the boats. Helicopters could classify them. And every ship in the formation had weapons that could rip the swarm apart if the order came. But rules of engagement do not exist to make soldiers feel safe. They exist to stop one frightened moment from becoming a war nobody intended to start. So the strike group began with the usual ladder of pressure. Bridge-to-bridge warnings went out. The destroyer sounded danger signals. An MH-60R lifted off to orbit the screen line with its crew chief behind a machine gun and Hellfires hanging ready. On the carrier, flight deck crews froze. knowing any launch order now would compete with the geometry below. Then the formation tightened and the time window collapsed. Two Iranian boats accelerated toward the destroyer on the van, forcing it to hold course a heartbeat longer than anyone liked before easing just enough to preserve separation without looking bullied out of the lane. Another pair cut across the cruiser's wake. One patrol craft came almost abeam of the carrier, close enough that the ship's sheer size made the small boat look suicidal. The radio warnings continued. No response worth trusting came back. The officer of the deck on the carrier could see what every sailor there understood instantly. If the lead boats made one more aggressive move, the escorts would have to act before the carrier's own mass trapped the whole group inside somebody else's plan. That was when the air call went out for the option nobody expected to see. First, a pair of A-10 Warthogs had been sitting on strip alert at a forward Gulf base, armed for exactly the kind of low-end maritime threat that never looks low-end once it gets close enough. People think of the A-10 as a tank killer, a gun with wings. In the Gulf, it offered something different and almost tailor-made for this problem. It could get airborne fast, stay on station, and sort small moving targets visually in cluttered coastal water. And unlike a high-flying fighter built around speed and standoff missiles, the Warthog could make a patrol boat crew feel watched, fixed, and seconds from destruction. The scramble clock started with practiced violence, canopies down, engines spooling, last armament checks, target data flowing through the stack from ships already painting the boats and from the helicopter overhead. The pilots did not need a long brief. The situation was simple in the way the worst situations always are. Friendly carrier group in restricted waters, multiple armed small craft inside unsafe proximity. No confirmed hostile fire yet, but hostile intent rising. Show force first, disable if fired upon, protect the ships. 9 minutes after the alert, the Warthogs were off the ground and driving hard over the Gulf. Down on the water, the crisis was still climbing. The helicopters helped, but they could not be everywhere at once. The swarm had spread into layers, some boats close, some offset, some hanging back like a reserve. That was dangerous. A boat that lingers far enough away can look passive right up until it surges into the lane or launches something ugly through the clutter. The destroyer and cruiser both had the contacts boxed in sensors and sights, but every American commander in the formation knew the same truth. If firing started at these ranges, seconds would decide who got the first clean shot. The lead A-10 checked in before the boats ever saw it. Then the sound reached the water and heads began turning north to south across the sky. The first jet came in low enough to be unmistakable, not screaming at high altitude like a distant guardian, but muscling into the battle space like an aircraft that intended to stay. The second held offset higher, using its targeting pod to sort the cluster and build a clean weapons picture. Link feeds, voice calls, and visual marks, i.e. fused fast. The pilots were now doing what the platform still does better than almost anything in the inventory, making chaos readable. That alone changed the board. A fast boat can harass a ship and dart away from a helicopter. It cannot pretend not to understand what an armed A-10 overhead means. The Warthog is brutally honest. Its silhouette is a warning. Its gun is a deadline. The first pilot rolled into a dry show of force pass over the nearest group, crossing the carrier's threatened side and dropping low over the water with the kind of deliberate aggression that sends spray outward and courage inward. Several Iranian boats broke formation instantly. Two did not. One of those two made the moment real. Instead of turning out, the boat punched ahead and angled toward the destroyer's path, bow rising, engine whining, a mounted weapon still trained forward. Another to the rear loosed smoke and tried to use the confusion to shift position off the cruiser's stern. The helicopter crew reported one of the forward boats had men moving around a launcher tube or rocket rack. That was enough for the American commander to stop asking what this might become and start acting on what it already was. Warning flares shot from the destroyer. Horn blasts cut across the water. The lead A-10 was cleared for a disabling strike if the boat continued its run. It continued. The Warthog rolled in from the starboard side, nose slightly low, airspeed controlled, target pod locked. Not a cinematic dive, not a reckless charge, just a professional attack profile against a very small problem with very large consequences. The pilot chose APKWS over the gun for the first shot, not because the gun lacked power, but because precision mattered more than spectacle. The laser-guided rocket left the rail in a clean flash and crossed the water so quickly the boat's crew never had time to turn fear into motion. The hit landed just aft of the bow, wrecking the engine compartment and punching the patrol craft sideways in a cloud of spray, smoke, and shredded fiberglass. The second hostile boat broke hard, but too late to keep the engagement contained. A burst of tracer snapped from somewhere inside the swarm, not enough to threaten the carrier, but enough to end the ambiguity. The escorts had their hostile act. The second A-10 descended immediately, while the helicopter called out the source craft. This time the pilot used the GAU-8. Anyone who has never heard that cannon imagines it as noise. It is more violent than that. It sounds like matter being torn apart by a machine that was designed with no patience for excuses. The A-10 fired a short burst, exactly what was needed and nothing more. 30-millimeter rounds walked across the waterline of the offending boat, smashing hull, fuel, and momentum in less than a second. The craft did not explode into a movie fireball. It simply ceased to be part of the fight. That was worse for the men watching because it proved the Americans were not warning anymore. They were selecting targets. And that broke the swarm. The boats that had looked so confident minutes earlier suddenly scattered into survival logic. Some turned north toward Iranian waters at full throttle. Others cut engines and raised hands to show distance from their weapons. A few remained dangerously close, but now every one of them was trapped under overlapping American control, helicopter optics, shipboard guns, fire control solutions, and two Warthogs circling like armored vultures. The cruiser shifted to cover the carrier's exposed quarter. The destroyer resumed the lane with enough authority to make clear the formation had not been stopped. No additional rockets flew, no missiles appeared, no one on the American side had to ask for a third pass. The whole violent phase lasted less time than most people spend choosing coffee. Afterward, the sea looked deceptively normal again, which is often how near war hides itself. Damaged debris trailed where the first boat had been hit. One crippled patrol craft burned low and black on the water until Iranian support vessels began moving from farther off to recover survivors and collect whatever narrative they could salvage. The carrier never stopped. On deck, launch crews stayed ready in case the next layer of escalation came from shore batteries, drones, or aircraft. In the combat information centers, nobody relaxed. Incidents like this do not end when the shooting stops. They end when every radar picture stays boring long enough for commanders to believe the region has decided not to light itself on fire today. The political shock arrived almost as fast as the rockets had. Tehran would frame the strike as aggression. Washington would frame it as self-defense in international waters. Both claims would race through embassies, ministries, and television studios before the smoke finished drifting over the strait. But beneath the messaging, every military planner in the region would log the same lesson. Small boat harassment works right up until the defender can fuse sea control and low-altitude precision faster than the swarm can mass. Once that happens, speed stops being an advantage. It becomes a coffin with an outboard motor. The deeper lesson was even harder. Carriers dominate oceans, but in narrow waters, even giants depend on the smallest margins. 1,000 feet is not much when the object closing on you carries explosives, rockets, or cameras for a manufactured humiliation. 9 minutes is not much when rules of engagement, sovereign coastlines, civilian shipping, and national pride are all compressed into one tactical picture. Yet the side that wins that moment is not always the side with the most steel. It is the side that can recognize hostile intent fastest, move a precise weapon into the gap, and still stop short of a wider war. That day, the United States did exactly that. The escorts held discipline under provocation, the helicopter kept the screen from going blind, and the A-10, a jet, many people keep trying to retire into history, proved why ugly aircraft survive elegant theories. It arrived fast enough to matter, low enough to understand the fight, and precise enough to end it without turning the entire Gulf into a furnace. In the Strait of Hormuz, empires do not collide first with fleets or speeches. They collide with distance, nerve, and the men who decide what one more second is worth. 20 patrol boats tested that math beside an American carrier. 9 minutes later, the answer was circling overhead.